When 17-year-old Danny Chun walked into Riverside High School that September morning, nobody expected the quiet Asian kid to become the most talked about student in the entire district. What happened 3 weeks later would be recorded on dozens of phones, shared millions of times across social media, and forever change how people thought about assumptions, appearances, and the dangerous game of underestimating someone based on how they look. This isn't just another bullying story. This is about what happens when predators pick the wrong prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Danny Chun had perfected the art of becoming invisible. At 5'5" and barely 130 pounds, he moved through the crowded hallways of Riverside High like a shadow, his black hair falling across his eyes, his oversized hoodie swallowing his small frame. To his new classmates in Portland, Oregon, he was just another quiet transfer student who kept his head down and minded his own business. They had no way of knowing that those same steady hands that gripped his pencil during calculus had spent the last 8 years learning to break bones with surgical precision. His father, Master Sergeant David Chen, had been stationed at military bases across the world before settling the family in Portland after his retirement. Danny had grown up on bases in South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, where his father had insisted he learn not just the local languages, but the local fighting arts. By age 10, Danny was training 6 days a week in Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and traditional Wing Chun Kung Fu. By 15, he was sparring with grown men who outweighed him by 50 pounds and walking away victorious. But his father had taught him something more important than how to fight. He had taught him when not to fight, the warrior's greatest strength. His father would say in Mandarin during their evening conversations, is knowing that true power comes from restraint. A master never needs to prove his skill to anyone but himself. Danny had carried these words with him through every school transfer, every new beginning, every moment when other kids tested him because he was different, because he was small, because he was Asian in schools where Asian meant automatic target. His mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, worked 18-hour shifts at Oregon Health and Science University's Trauma Center, trying to establish herself in a new city while her husband adapted to civilian life after 23 years in the military. The family lived in a modest apartment in southeast Portland, far from the wealthy suburbs where most of Riverside High students called home. Danny rode 2 buses to get to school each morning, his worn backpack containing textbooks that had seen better days and a lunch his mother packed at 5 a.m. before leaving for her shift. The first 2 weeks at Riverside had been blissfully uneventful. Danny attended his classes, ate lunch alone while reading science fiction novels, and caught his buses home without incident. His teachers quickly recognized his intelligence. A PE chemistry teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had even asked if he'd consider joining the academic decathlon team. For a brief moment, Danny had allowed himself to hope that this school might be different, that he might actually make it through his senior year without incident. That hope died on a Tuesday morning in late September when he encountered Bradley Morrison for the first time. Bradley was everything Danny wasn't. 6'2" with the kind of natural athleticism that came from good genetics and better nutrition. He was the starting quarterback for the Riverside Ravens and the son of a prominent local judge. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, his clothes carried designer labels, and he moved through the school like he owned it, which, in many ways, he did. Bradley had been king of his social circle since elementary school, and he ruled through a combination of charm, intimidation, and the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to those who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Danny first appeared on Bradley's radar during third period, American History. Mr. Patterson was discussing the Vietnam War when he asked if anyone knew about the role of special forces in the conflict. Danny had raised his hand quietly and provided A detailed, nuanced answer that demonstrated not just textbook knowledge, but the kind of understanding that came from growing up in a military family. The teacher had been impressed. Several students had turned to look at the quiet new kid with newfound interest. Bradley had noticed too, but for different reasons. He didn't like being upstaged, especially by someone who looked like they should be delivering his family's takeout order rather than showing him up in front of his girlfriend and her friends. After class, Bradley made a point of bumping into Danny at his locker, hard enough to send his books scattering across the hallway floor. "Sorry, didn't see you there," Bradley had said with a smirk, making sure his voice carried to the students. Walking past. "Maybe you should eat more. Get some meat on those bones." Danny had simply gathered his books in silence and walked away, but Bradley had seen something in that moment of contact. He had felt the surprising solidness of Danny's frame beneath that oversized hoodie, had noticed how the smaller boy had absorbed the impact without stumbling, had caught a glimpse of something in those dark eyes that looked older than 17. It should have been a warning. Instead, it made Bradley more curious, more determined to find out what buttons he could push. The pattern started small, as it always did. Bradley would make comments about Danny's clothes, his size, his race. He would knock books from his hands in the hallway, always with a theatrical apology that fooled the teachers, but fooled no one else. His friends, Jake Martinez and Trevor Walsh, quickly joined in, sensing opportunity in their leader's new fixation. They were smaller predators following a larger one, content to feast on whatever scraps of power Bradley threw their way. Danny endured it all with the same quiet dignity his father had taught him. He cleaned up whatever mess they made, picked up whatever they knocked down, and continued through his days as if nothing had happened. But inside, behind those calm dark eyes, Danny Chen was making calculations. He was measuring distances, cataloging weaknesses, and remembering every slight with the precision of someone trained to never forget a lesson. He had no idea that his restraint was about to be tested in ways that would force him to choose between his father's teachings and his own survival. The escalation came during lunch period on a Thursday afternoon, early October. Danny had found his usual spot in the far corner of the cafeteria, a table near the windows that offered a clear view of the exits and kept his back to the wall. Old habits from a childhood spent on military bases where situational awareness was as natural as breathing. He was halfway through a worn paperback copy of Ender's Game when Bradley Morrison's shadow fell across his table. Bradley wasn't alone. Jake Martinez flanked his left side, all swagger and nervous energy, his letterman jacket advertising his status as varsity soccer midfielder. Jake had transferred to Riverside 2 years earlier from East LA, and he'd learned quickly that aligning himself with Bradley Morrison was his ticket to social acceptance in a school where his last name and accent might otherwise make him a target. He was shorter than Bradley, but built like a boxer, with quick hands and quicker temper that Bradley had learned to weaponize for his own amusement. On Bradley's right stood Trevor Walsh, whose family had moved to Portland from Alabama when his father took a position at Nike's corporate headquarters. Trevor was tall and lanky, with the kind of nervous laugh that accompanied every cruel comment he made. He wasn't naturally vicious like Bradley, but he was weak, and weakness in the presence of power often manifested as cruelty toward those with even less protection. Trevor had learned that echoing Bradley's attacks kept him safe from becoming the target himself. Danny didn't look up from his book immediately. He could sense their presence, could read the tension in their posture through his peripheral vision, but he continued reading the same paragraph about battle school tactics for the third time. His father had taught him that appearing unaware often made predators overconfident, and overconfident opponents made mistakes. Well, Bradley said, his voice pitched loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. If it isn't our resident fortune cookie, deep in some nerd fantasy. Danny continued reading, but his grip on the book tightened almost imperceptibly. Bradley noticed and smiled. The reaction was small, but it was there. And Bradley Morrison had spent his entire life learning to read people's weaknesses like sheet music. Jake snickered on cue, playing his role in the familiar theater of teenage hierarchy. "Yo, Bruce Lee," Jake called out, adopting the fake tough guy accent he'd developed to mask his own insecurities. "You gonna say something, or just sit there like a little monk?" Danny finally looked up, meeting Bradley's eyes with the same calm expression he'd worn during their previous encounters. His dark eyes gave nothing away, but Bradley felt a flutter of something unexpected. Not quite fear, but a recognition that this wasn't going according to the usual script. Most kids either cowered or got angry when confronted. This one just watched, like he was studying them, cataloging their behavior for some future reference. "I'm trying to read," Danny said quietly, his voice carrying just a hint of his mother's Taiwanese accent. His English was perfect, refined by years of private tutors on military bases, but the subtle musicality of his pronunciation made it clear that English wasn't his first language. Bradley latched onto this like a shark scenting blood. "Oh, you're trying to read," Bradley repeated, exaggerating Danny's slight accent until it sounded like a caricature from a bad movie. "What is it? Instructions for your family's restaurant? A manual on kung fu fighting? Maybe love letters from your girlfriend back in China?" Danny's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "I'm from Texas originally. My father was stationed at Fort Hood before we moved here." The correction was factual, polite, and completely ignored by his tormentors. Trevor laughed his nervous laugh and leaned forward. "Fort Hood? What was your dad, the base janitor? No offense, but you don't exactly look like military material. More like someone who'd run away crying the first time they heard gunfire." The comment hit deeper than Trevor could have known. Danny's father had indeed heard plenty of gunfire during 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan. He'd earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart before taking a desk job to keep his family stable. But Danny said nothing, letting the ignorant comment hang in the air like smoke. Bradley sensed an opportunity in Danny's silence. He reached down and plucked the paperback from Danny's hands with casual arrogance. "Ender's Game," he read aloud, flipping through the pages with deliberate carelessness. "Isn't this about some kid who kills people in space? Figures that's what gets you excited, Bruce." The nickname was carefully chosen. Bruce, as in Bruce Lee, reducing Danny's entire identity to a single stereotypical reference point. It was the kind of casual racism that Bradley's social circle would find amusing rather than offensive, couched in enough plausible deniability that any adult who overheard would struggle to call it outright bullying. Danny extended his hand. Calmly, "May I have my book back, please?" The please seemed to delight Bradley in the same way a cat might be pleased by a mouse's futile struggling. He held the book higher, just out of Danny's reach. "You know what? I think I might want to read this myself. Learn some of those space fighting moves. Maybe it'll help me understand how your mind works." Jake and Trevor positioned themselves to block Danny's exit routes, a move so practiced it was clearly choreographed. Other students at nearby tables began to notice the confrontation, some pulling out phones to record what looked like it might escalate into something more entertaining than their usual lunch period boredom. Danny stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He was still several inches shorter than Bradley, and his small frame made the size difference even more pronounced. To the watching students, it looked like a mouse confronting a lion. They had no way of knowing that the mouse had spent years learning to bring down creatures much larger than itself. "The book belongs to the school library," Danny said, his voice never rising above conversational level. "I need to return it by Friday, or I'll owe a fine that my family can't afford to pay." The mention of his family's financial situation brought grins to his tormentors' faces. Poverty was another weakness they could exploit, another lever they could use to apply pressure. Bradley made a show of examining the book more closely, noting the worn cover and the library barcode on the spine. "Poor little Bruce can't afford a $2 library fine," Trevor mocked. "Maybe if your parents worked harder instead of just cooking chow mein all day, you wouldn't have to worry about money." Danny's breathing remained steady, but something shifted in his posture. It was subtle, almost invisible, but suddenly he seemed more grounded, more present. His weight had shifted to the balls of his feet, and his hands hung loose at his sides in a way that would have been instantly recognizable to anyone with martial arts training. Unfortunately for Bradley and his friends, none of them had spent enough time in actual combat sports to recognize the warning signs. "My mother is a trauma surgeon," Danny said quietly. "My father served 23 years in the United States Army. They work harder than anyone in this room, and they've sacrificed more than you can imagine to give me opportunities you take for granted." The dignity in his voice, the quiet pride, should have been another warning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, it only inflamed Bradley's desire to break this composed facade and get the reaction he was looking for. He opened the book to a random page and pretended to read aloud in a mocking, high-pitched voice that was supposed to sound Asian. Bradley's performance was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Patterson, the same history teacher who had witnessed Danny's impressive knowledge of military history. The older man's presence immediately changed the dynamic at the table, causing Jake and Trevor to step back and assume expressions of casual innocence. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Mr. Patterson asked, his experienced eye taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had broken up hundreds of similar confrontations over his 30-year teaching career. "No problem at all, Mr. Patterson," Bradley replied smoothly, handing the book back to Danny with exaggerated courtesy. "We were just discussing literature with our new classmate here. Fascinating stuff about space battles and strategy." Danny accepted the book without comment, but Mr. Patterson caught the slight tremor in the boy's hands that suggested this interaction had been more stressful than his calm demeanor indicated. The teacher made a mental note to keep an eye on this particular group dynamic. As Mr. Patterson moved on and the crowd of onlookers dispersed, Bradley leaned close to Danny's ear and whispered something that made the smaller boy's entire body go rigid. The words were too quiet for anyone else to hear, but their effect was immediate and unmistakable. Danny remained seated as Bradley and his friends walked away, laughing and high-fiving each other over their successful intimidation. But his calm facade was beginning to show cracks, and the book in his hands was shaking slightly as he tried to resume reading. What Bradley Morrison didn't realize was that his whispered threat had just crossed a line that Danny Chen had spent his entire life learning to defend. The quiet new kid wasn't going to stay quiet much longer. The harassment began in earnest. The following Monday morning, Danny arrived at his locker to find it decorated with takeout menus from every Chinese restaurant in a 20-mile radius, taped across the metal surface like some twisted collage of cultural stereotyping. Students walking past snickered and pointed, some stopping to take pictures with their phones before moving on to their first period classes. Danny removed each menu methodically, folding them neatly before placing them in the nearest trash can, his expression betraying nothing of the humiliation burning in his chest. Bradley Morrison watched from across the hallway, flanked by his usual crew and clearly pleased with his handiwork. The quarterback had arrived early specifically to witness Danny's reaction to his morning surprise, hoping to catch some sign of anger or distress that would justify escalating his campaign further. When Danny simply cleaned up the mess and headed to class without so much as a backward glance, Bradley felt both frustrated and oddly impressed. Most kids would have either exploded in rage or broken down in tears by now. During second period English, Mrs. Hendricks was discussing Asian American literature when Bradley raised his hand with mock enthusiasm. "Mrs. Hendricks," he said with the kind of innocent tone that immediately put experienced teachers on alert. I was wondering if Danny could give us some authentic perspective on these themes, since he probably has more cultural insight than the rest of us. The request sounded reasonable enough on the surface, but Danny recognized it for what it was: an attempt to other him, to mark him as fundamentally different from his classmates, to turn his heritage into a spotlight that would make him squirm. Every eye in the classroom turned toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to being singled out. I'm American, Danny replied simply. I was born in San Antonio. I've lived on military bases most of my life. I probably have less connection to traditional Asian culture than some of you do to your own family histories. His response was factual and delivered without defensiveness, but it clearly wasn't what Bradley had been hoping for. The quarterback's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Danny filed away for future reference. Bradley Morrison didn't like being outmaneuvered, especially in front of an audience. At lunch, Danny discovered that his usual corner table had been claimed by a group of freshman girls who giggled nervously when he approached. One of them, a redhead with braces, looked up apologetically. Sorry, we were told this table was reserved. Now by Bradley Morrison. The girls scattered quickly, leaving Danny standing alone with his lunch tray while other students watched to see what he would do. He found another seat at a table full of underclassmen who avoided eye contact when he sat down. Within minutes, Jake Martinez appeared with a camera phone, making a show of taking pictures of Danny eating his sandwich. For the school newspaper, Jake announced loudly, "We're doing a feature on international students and their traditional foods." Danny continued eating without acknowledging the performance, but he noticed how the younger students at his table grew increasingly uncomfortable. One by one, they found excuses to leave until Danny was sitting alone again, exactly as Bradley had intended. The isolation was surgical in its precision, designed to demonstrate that associating with Danny Chen came with social consequences that most students weren't willing to risk. The campaign expanded beyond school walls when Danny discovered that someone had created a fake social media profile using his yearbook photo. The account posted broken English messages filled with stereotypical references to martial arts movies and fortune cookies. Within hours, screenshots were circulating through group chats and Instagram stories, turning Danny into a walking meme for his classmates' entertainment. His parents noticed the change in his demeanor during dinner that Wednesday evening. His father, ever observant from years of military service, picked up on the subtle signs of stress that Danny thought he was concealing. His mother, trained to recognize trauma in her patients, saw the familiar tension in his shoulders that spoke of someone under sustained pressure. "Everything satisfactory at the new school, son?" Master Sergeant Chen asked in Mandarin, using their family language to create a space where Danny might feel safer speaking honestly. Danny considered lying, but his father had always been able to see through deception with uncomfortable accuracy. "Some students are testing boundaries," he replied carefully, also in Mandarin. "Nothing I cannot handle." His mother set down her chopsticks and studied his face with the clinical assessment that made her so effective in the trauma bay. "These tests," she said gently, "are they physical in nature? Should we be concerned about your safety?" The concern in her voice was genuine, but Danny knew that involving his parents would only make the situation worse. Military families dealt with transfers and new schools regularly, and part of growing up was learning to handle social challenges independently. Besides, what could he tell them? That other students were calling him names and posting fake social media accounts. That they were systematically isolating him and turning his heritage into a source of entertainment? It sounded petty when reduced to bare facts, even though the cumulative effect was grinding away at his composure. "I can handle it," he repeated, but his father's expression suggested the conversation was far from over. Thursday brought a new escalation when Danny opened his gym locker to find his clothes soaked with soy sauce. The smell was overwhelming, and the dark stain had ruined his favorite shirt, one of the few pieces of clothing that actually fit him properly. Worse than the destruction was the message it sent. Even his most private spaces weren't safe from Bradley's reach. Coach Williams, a former Marine who ran the physical education program with military precision, noticed Danny standing motionless in front of his locker. The older man's nose wrinkled at the smell, and his expression darkened when he realized. What had happened? Who did this, Chun? Coach Williams demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Danny appreciated the coach's directness, but he also understood that snitching would only provide Bradley with justification for further escalation. I don't know, sir. It must have happened while we were in class. Coach Williams clearly didn't believe him, but he also recognized the code that prevented students from naming their tormentors. He found Danny a spare gym uniform and made a note to pay closer attention to locker room dynamics, but both man and boy knew that adult supervision could only do so much against teenagers determined to cause harm. The psychological warfare intensified during Friday's chemistry lab when Danny discovered that his assigned lab partner had mysteriously switched sections, leaving him to work alone on experiments designed for pairs. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to reassign him, but every other partnership claimed to be full, forcing Danny to attempt complex procedures without assistance while his classmates worked in comfortable collaboration. Bradley made sure to position himself where Danny could see him whispering to other students, pointing in Danny's direction and triggering bursts of laughter that felt like physical blows. The isolation was becoming complete, transforming Danny from a new student trying to fit in into a pariah that others avoided for fear of becoming targets themselves. But it was the incident in the hallway after 7th period that finally cracked Danny's carefully maintained composure. He was walking toward his locker when Trevor Walsh stepped directly into his path, forcing Danny to stop short to avoid collision. Behind him, Jake Martinez moved to block his retreat, creating a human corridor that funneled Danny toward where Bradley Morrison waited with his phone camera ready. The trap was perfectly executed, drawing a crowd of students who sensed that something significant was about to happen. Danny found himself surrounded by a circle of his peers, most of whom he'd never spoken to, but all of whom seemed eager to witness whatever entertainment Bradley had planned. Well, Bradley announced, his voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd. Look what we have here. Our little ninja, trying to sneak around like he's invisible. The crowd chuckled appreciatively, and Danny felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded the old survival instincts. Danny tried to step around the human barrier, but Jake shifted to maintain the blockade. Where are you going so fast, Bruce? We just want to talk. The fake friendliness in Jake's voice was more menacing than open hostility would have been. The circle was tightening now, and Danny could count at least 15 students with their phones out, recording every moment for later distribution across social media platforms. He was trapped in a digital coliseum, and the crowd was hungry for a show. I need to catch my bus, Danny said quietly, making one more attempt at de-escalation. Your bus can wait, Bradley replied, stepping closer until he was well within Danny's personal space. We've been talking about you, Bruce, wondering about some things. Like whether all those kung fu movies are actually based on reality, or if they're just Hollywood nonsense designed to make people like you feel special. The casual racism in Bradley's words was delivered with a smile, making it clear that this was entertainment for him, not genuine malice. Somehow that made it worse. Danny was being destroyed for Bradley Morrison's amusement, reduced to a stereotype for the entertainment of people who would never see him as fully human. Danny's hands remained steady at his sides, but something fundamental was shifting inside him. The careful restraint his father had taught him was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure of weeks of systematic dehumanization. The quiet boy who just wanted to finish high school and move on with his life was slowly giving way to something much more dangerous. Bradley Morrison had no idea how close he was to discovering exactly what 8 years of intensive martial arts training could accomplish when restraint finally gave way to action. The crowd pressed closer as Bradley reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Danny's blood turn to ice. It was a small silver chain with 2 rectangular metal tags hanging from it, scratched and worn from years of wear. Danny's father's dog tags, which he kept in his gym bag as a reminder of the sacrifices his family had made for his freedom. "How did you get those?" Danny's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was something new in his tone that made several students in the front row take an involuntary step backward. Bradley held the dog tags up like a trophy, letting them catch the fluorescent hallway light as they swayed from the chain. "Found them in your gym bag during 5th period," he announced to the crowd. "Thought everyone might be interested in learning a little more about our mysterious transfer student." Jake Martinez stepped forward with his phone, zooming in on the tags. As Bradley read the information engraved on them aloud, David Chen, United States Army, born April 5-10, 1975, blood type O positive. The crowd murmured with interest, treating the private family information like entertainment gossip. "Give them back," Danny said, extending his hand with what appeared to be calm politeness. "Those belong to my father." "Your father?" Bradley's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "You mean the guy who supposedly served in the army? Tell me, Bruce, what exactly did Daddy do over there? Was he one of those guys who served food in the mess hall? Maybe cleaned toilets for the real soldiers?" Well, Bradley announced, his voice carrying clearly through the cafeteria and causing conversations at nearby tables to die down as students turned to watch the unfolding drama. "If it isn't our favorite little ninja, still pretending to be invisible." Danny closed his book carefully and placed it in his backpack, movements that appeared calm and methodical, but were actually the preparatory ritual he had learned from his martial arts training. The careful organization of his possessions, the deliberate placement of obstacles, the mental calculation of distances and angles. To the watching students, he looked like someone resignedly preparing to endure another round of humiliation. In reality, he was a weapon system coming online. Jake Martinez stepped closer, emboldened by the crowd and the certainty that their victim would continue to absorb whatever punishment they chose to deliver. "Hey Bruce," Jake called out, using the nickname that had stuck despite Danny's repeated corrections. "We were just talking about you in pay class. Coach Williams was asking about your athletic abilities." The lie was transparent and cruel, designed to draw attention to Danny's apparent physical weakness in front of an audience that valued athletic prowess above almost everything else. Several students in the crowd snickered, and Danny could see others whispering among themselves, treating his humiliation like entertainment programming designed for their amusement. Trevor Walsh, not to be outdone by his friends, decided to contribute his own twist to the performance. "Yeah, we told him you were probably really good at ping pong or badminton. You know, those sports that don't require actual strength or courage." The casual racism in Trevor's comment drew more laughter from the crowd, and Danny felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that he had been suppressing for weeks. But alongside the anger was something else, something colder and more calculating. His father had taught him that anger was a tool to be used, not an emotion to be controlled by, and Danny was beginning to understand the difference between those two concepts. Bradley stepped even closer, positioning himself directly in front of Danny's table in a clear display of dominance. The quarterback was several inches taller and at least 50 pounds heavier than the slight Asian boy, and he used every inch of that physical advantage to create an intimidating presence. But as he stared down at Danny, Bradley felt a flicker of the same unease that had been growing since the incident with the dog tags. There was something different about Danny today. His posture was the same. His expression remained calm and controlled, but there was an energy radiating from him that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, almost invisible, But Bradley had grown up around competitive athletes, and he recognized the feeling of being in the presence of someone who was no longer willing to back down. "You know what I think, Bruce?" Bradley said, his voice dropping to a more personal register that somehow made his words more menacing than his previous public declarations. "I think you're a fraud. I think all this quiet, mysterious act is just covering up the fact that you're exactly what you look like. A weak, scared little kid who's never stood up for anything in his entire life." The words were carefully chosen to sting, to provoke the kind of reaction that would justify whatever Bradley had planned next. But instead of anger or hurt, Danny's response was a slight smile that never quite reached his eyes. It was the expression of someone who had just heard something amusing rather than insulting, and it threw Bradley completely off his prepared script. "That's an interesting theory," Danny replied quietly, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the immediate crowd, but maintaining the conversational tone that had characterized all their previous interactions. "But you know what they say about assumptions." The calm response clearly wasn't what Bradley had been expecting, and Danny could see the frustration building in the larger boy's expression. Bradley Morrison was accustomed to getting reactions from his victims, either cowering submission or explosive anger that would justify escalation. Danny's continued composure was disrupting the familiar pattern of their encounters, and Bradley was beginning to feel like he was losing control of the situation. Jake Martinez, sensing his leader's frustration, decided to take a more direct approach. He reached across the table and knocked Danny's water bottle to the floor, sending it rolling across the linoleum with a hollow plastic sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Oops," Jake said with exaggerated innocence, his grin wide and predatory. "Clumsy me. Maybe you should pick that up, Bruce." Danny looked at the water bottle lying on the floor, then back at Jake with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the encounter. "I'll get it when you move," he said simply. The response was polite but firm, drawing an audible reaction from the watching crowd. Several students exchanged glances, sensing that something significant was happening, but not quite understanding what it was. Danny Chen, the quiet transfer student who had absorbed weeks of harassment without complaint, was finally showing signs of resistance. Trevor Walsh stepped forward to block Danny's path to the water bottle, creating a human barrier that forced Danny to either submit to their control or find a way around them. The trap was simple but effective, designed to demonstrate Danny's powerlessness in front of the largest audience they had managed to assemble. "Problem, Bruce?" Trevor asked with mock concern. "Can't handle a simple task like picking up your own trash?" Danny stood slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He was still shorter than all three of his tormentors, still physically outmatched by any reasonable assessment, but something about his posture had changed. The watching students couldn't quite identify what was different, but several of them found themselves taking involuntary steps backward, as if responding to some primitive warning signal. "No problem at all," Danny replied, his voice carrying a new undertone of authority that made Trevor's smirk falter slightly. "But I think there might be a misunderstanding about who's going to move first." Bradley Morrison felt the situation slipping away from him and decided to reassert control through the most direct means available. He had planned this moment carefully, choosing the most humiliating gesture he could think of to finally break Danny's composure and establish his dominance once and for all. Without warning, Bradley hawked up a mouthful of saliva and spat directly at Danny's face. The projectile arced through the air in what seemed like slow motion, captured by dozens of phone cameras as it traveled the short distance between the two boys. To the watching crowd, it appeared that Danny was too shocked or too slow to react, simply standing there as the ultimate insult approached his face. What they couldn't see was that Danny's enhanced reflexes, trained through thousands of hours of martial arts practice, had tracked the trajectory of Bradley's spit from the moment it left his mouth. Time seemed to dilate as Danny's nervous system shifted into the combat mode his father had spent years teaching him to access. Every detail became crystal clear: the angle of approach, the rotation of the saliva, the exact moment when evasive action would be most effective. Danny moved. To the untrained eye, he simply tilted his head slightly to the left. But that subtle movement, timed with mathematical precision, caused Bradley's spit to sail harmlessly past his ear and splatter against the wall behind him. The evasion was so smooth and effortless that it took several seconds for the watching crowd to realize what had actually happened. Bradley Morrison stood frozen, his mouth still open from the effort of spitting, staring at Danny with dawning horror as he realized that his ultimate gesture of disrespect had been casually avoided with what looked like supernatural reflexes. "That," Danny said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence that had fallen over the cafeteria, "was a mistake." What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed frame by frame by martial arts experts, and discussed in forums dedicated to real-life combat encounters. But for the students watching it happen in real time, it was like witnessing magic. Danny moved forward in a fluid motion that seemed to defy physics. One moment he was standing 3 feet away from Bradley Morrison, the next he was somehow inside the larger boy's guard, his right hand positioned against Bradley's throat in what looked like a gentle touch but felt like a steel cable against the quarterback's windpipe. Bradley tried to step backward, but found that his legs wouldn't respond properly. Danny's left hand had somehow found a pressure point on his hip that sent waves of numbness down his entire left side. The quarterback, who had built his reputation on physical dominance and athletic superiority, was suddenly as helpless as a newborn child. Jake Martinez lunged forward to help his friend, his hands reaching for Danny's shoulders in an attempt to pull him away from Bradley. Jake was fast, trained by years of soccer to react quickly in crowded situations, but Danny moved like he was operating in a different time zone entirely. Without releasing his hold on Bradley, Danny pivoted on his left foot and drove his right elbow into Jake's solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact was perfectly calculated, hard enough to instantly paralyze Jake's diaphragm, but not hard enough to cause permanent damage. Jake folded over like he had been struck by lightning, gasping helplessly as his body forgot how to breathe. Trevor Walsh, witnessing the impossibly fast takedown of his two friends, made the intelligent decision to back away rather than join the encounter. His survival instincts, honed by years of avoiding becoming a target himself, recognized that Danny Chen was operating on a completely different level than anything they had prepared for. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds. Danny stepped back, releasing his holds and allowing Bradley and Jake to collapse to the floor where they lay gasping and trying to process what had just happened to them. He looked around. The circle of stunned faces, making eye contact with several students who had been laughing and recording just moments before. "My name," Danny said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent cafeteria, "is Danny Chen. Not Bruce. Not Ninja. Not any of the other names you've been calling me. I am the son of Master Sergeant David Chen, who served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and earned 2 Bronze Stars protecting soldiers who looked just like you." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "For the past month, you've been testing me, pushing me, trying to break me down because I'm different from what you're used to. You assume that because I'm small and quiet and prefer books to football, I must be weak. You assumed that because my parents are immigrants, I must be inferior. You assumed that because I didn't fight back immediately, I must be incapable of fighting back at all." Danny looked down at Bradley, who was still struggling to regain his breath and his composure. "You were wrong about all of those things. I have spent the last 8 years training in Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Wing Chun Kung Fu under masters who have forgotten more about combat than you will ever learn. I can break bones, dislocate joints, and stop a man's heart with my bare hands. I know 17 different ways to render someone unconscious and 12 different ways to kill without leaving obvious evidence. The mathematical precision of his words, delivered in the same calm tone he had used throughout their previous encounters, had a more profound impact on the listening crowd than any amount of shouting or dramatic posturing could have achieved. But more importantly, Danny continued, I was taught that true strength comes from protecting others, not from hurting them. I was taught that a real warrior only fights when all other options have been exhausted. For a month, I have given you every opportunity to choose a different path, to be better than your worst impulses. He gestured to the phone still recording around the circle. Instead, you chose this. You chose to escalate until the only response left was the one you're seeing now. You forced me to choose between my principles and my dignity, and you're not going to like living with the consequences of that choice. Danny reached down and helped Jake to his feet, supporting the still gasping boy with gentle hands that had just demonstrated their lethal potential. He guided Jake to a nearby chair and made sure he was breathing properly before turning his attention to Bradley, who was finally managing to sit up. You have two choices now, Danny said, extending his hand to help Bradley stand. You can continue this path, in which case I will defend myself with whatever level of force becomes necessary. Or you can choose to be better than you have been, in which case we can move forward as if this never happened. Bradley stared at the offered hand for a long moment, his pride warring with the growing realization that he had just discovered what a real predator looked like. Danny Chen wasn't the helpless victim Bradley had imagined him to be. He was something far more dangerous, a trained killer who had been choosing restraint out of principle rather than inability. Slowly, carefully, Bradley reached up and grasped Danny's hand, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. The gesture felt like surrender, and in many ways it was. I'm sorry, Bradley whispered, the words barely audible but clearly sincere. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Danny nodded once, accepting the apology without comment. He picked up his backpack and walked calmly toward the cafeteria exit, leaving behind a crowd of students who were still processing what they had just witnessed. The footage went viral within hours. Expert analysts identified the techniques Danny had used. Military veterans commented on the restraint he had shown, and martial arts schools around the country began using the encounter as an example of proper combat discipline. But for the students at Riverside High School, the impact was more immediate and personal. Danny Chen was no longer the invisible transfer student. He had become something else entirely, a reminder that assumptions could be dangerous, that appearances could be deceiving, and that true strength often came in forms they had never learned to recognize. When he returned to school the following Monday, Danny found a different world waiting for him. Students who had ignored him before now nodded respectfully when they passed him in the hallways. Teachers looked at him with new interest and respect. And Bradley Morrison, along with his former crew, went out of their way to avoid any behavior that might be construed as threatening or disrespectful. Most importantly, Danny discovered that other students were approaching him for help. Younger kids who were dealing with their own bullying situations, transfer students struggling to find their place, anyone who felt powerless in the face of those who seemed stronger or more popular. Danny found himself becoming what his father had always intended him to be, a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. He started a martial arts club that met after school, teaching basic self-defense techniques to anyone who wanted to learn. He volunteered with the peer counseling program, helping students work through conflicts before they escalated to violence. And when necessary, he served as a quiet deterrent to those who might otherwise prey on the vulnerable. Danny Chen had finally found his place at Riverside High School, not as the invisible outsider he had tried to be, but as the guardian he had been trained to become. The quiet transfer student had transformed into something his tormentors never could have imagined. A young man who understood that true power came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when that ability should never be used. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. The insult hung in the air like poison, but Danny's expression remained controlled even as his fingers began to curl slightly at his sides. The dog tags represented 23 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and a Purple Heart earned. When his father's convoy hit an IED outside Kandahar, they weren't just pieces of metal. They were a legacy of honor that Bradley Morrison was treating like a prop in his cruel theater. "My father earned 2 Bronze Stars in Afghanistan," Danny replied steadily. He was a combat engineer who risked his life clearing roadside bombs to protect soldiers like the ones you're pretending he wasn't good enough to serve alongside. The dignity in Danny's response only seemed to encourage Bradley further. He began swinging the dog tags in wider arcs, making them clink together in a rhythm that sounded like mockery. "Bronze Stars," he repeated with exaggerated awe. "Wow, that's really impressive, Bruce. Too bad all that heroism didn't help him raise a son who knows how to stand up for himself." Trevor Walsh laughed nervously and added his own contribution to the torment. "Maybe the hero gene skipped a generation." "You? No, like how some families produce warriors and others produce takeout delivery boys." Danny's breathing remained steady, but something was happening to his posture that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with military or martial arts training. His weight had shifted to a perfect center of gravity, his shoulders had squared without appearing tense, and his hands had assumed positions that looked casual, but provided instant access to devastating striking angles. The crowd sensed the change without understanding it. The energy in the hallway had shifted from cruel entertainment to something more primal and dangerous. Several students on the outer edge of the circle began to back away, suddenly uncertain whether they wanted to be part of whatever was about to happen. Bradley, oblivious to the subtle signs of danger, decided to escalate further. He opened one of the dog tags and pretended to examine it more closely. "You know what I think, Bruce? I think maybe these are fake. I mean, what kind of real soldier would have a son who lets other kids push him around without fighting back? Maybe you bought these at some surplus store to make yourself feel special." The accusation of dishonor toward his father's service struck Danny like a physical blow. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped enough to reveal something cold and lethal underneath. It was the look of someone calculating distances, identifying targets, and preparing for violence with the methodical precision of a trained killer. Jake Martinez, standing close enough to see Danny's face clearly, felt a sudden chill of genuine fear. The quiet Asian kid wasn't looking scared or angry anymore. He was looking at Bradley the way a predator studies prey, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was no longer seeing a teenage bully, but rather a threat to be neutralized. "You're wrong about my father," Danny said, his voice dropping to a register that carried surprising authority. "And you're wrong about me." Bradley sensed that he was losing control of the situation, but couldn't understand why. The crowd was still watching, still recording, but the atmosphere had changed from anticipation to apprehension. To regain his dominance, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his high school career. He deliberately opened his fingers and let the dog tags fall toward the hard linoleum floor. Time seemed to slow as the silver chain dropped through the air. Danny's enhanced reflexes, honed by years of training that had taught him to catch arrows and deflect strikes faster than most people could blink, allowed him to track every inch of the tag's descent. He could have caught them easily, plucked them from the air before they hit the ground. His body was already moving, muscles coiled and ready to spring into action. But in that frozen moment, Danny heard his father's voice speaking Mandarin in his memory. "The greatest victory is the one that requires no battle, son. True strength is knowing when not to use your power." Danny forced himself to remain still, watching his father's dog tags hit the floor with a metallic clatter that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. The sound seemed to break some kind of spell, and the watching students shifted uncomfortably, as they realized they had just witnessed something genuinely cruel rather than harmlessly entertaining. Bradley stood over the fallen dog tags with a triumphant smile, clearly expecting Danny to either explode in rage or break down in humiliation. Instead, Danny simply knelt and picked up the chain, examining it carefully to ensure it hadn't been damaged. His movements were controlled and deliberate, but there was something about the way he handled the tags that suggested they meant more to him than his own life. When Danny stood back up, his eyes met Bradley's with an intensity that made the larger boy take an involuntary step backward. For a moment, Bradley glimpsed something in those dark eyes that reminded him of documentary footage he'd seen of actual combat veterans. There was a coldness there, a calculation that had nothing to do with teenage posturing and everything to do with genuine lethality. "You have no idea what you just did," Danny said quietly, slipping the dog tags into his pocket, where they would be safe from further violation. The threat wasn't shouted or delivered with dramatic gestures. It was spoken like a simple statement of fact, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than any blustering challenge would have been. Bradley found himself unable to respond, suddenly aware that he might have pushed the quiet transfer student past some invisible line that he didn't understand. The crowd began to disperse as teachers approached to investigate the commotion, but the damage had been done. Bradley Morrison had just learned that there were consequences to dishonoring the service of a Purple Heart recipient, even if those consequences hadn't materialized yet. Danny Chen walked away without another word, leaving Bradley standing in the empty hallway with the uncomfortable realization that he had just made an enemy unlike any he had faced before. The quiet kid with the ancient eyes had shown remarkable restraint in not responding to the provocation, but Bradley was beginning to suspect that restraint might not last forever. What he didn't know was that Danny had already decided that his father's teachings about avoiding violence were about to be tested in ways that neither of them had ever anticipated. The breaking point came exactly 1 week later during the lunch period, in the same corner of the cafeteria where Danny had been trying to find peace since his first day at Riverside High. The weather outside had turned gray and drizzling, typical for an Oregon October, and the confined energy of 500 teenagers trapped indoors had created an atmosphere of restless anticipation that seemed to crackle through the air like static electricity. Danny was reading quietly when he became aware of movement around his table. Not the usual flow of students heading to lunch lines or bathroom breaks, but something more deliberate and coordinated. He didn't look up immediately, but his peripheral vision caught the familiar figures of Bradley Morrison, Jake Martinez, and Trevor Walsh positioning themselves in a loose semicircle around his location. Behind them, he could see other students gathering, drawn by the promise of entertainment that seemed to follow Bradley wherever he went. What made this different from their previous confrontations was the presence of phones. Not just the usual handful of students recording for their personal social media accounts, but what appeared to be a coordinated effort to document whatever Bradley had planned. Danny counted at least 20 devices pointed in his direction, held by students who normally wouldn't give him a second glance, but were now eager to capture what was clearly going to be a significant moment in Riverside High's social hierarchy. Bradley stepped forward first, his confidence bolstered by the audience and the certainty that his campaign of systematic humiliation was about to reach its climax. He had spent the past week planning this moment, consulting with his friends about the most devastating way to finally break the quiet transfer student who had somehow managed to maintain his dignity through weeks of carefully orchestrated torment.